what's fascinating is that in an era when through the internet you can get information about anywhere in the world, often what people most want and don't get is really good news and knowledge about what's happening 2 or 3 streets away from them. So that's the sort of demand for hyperlocal media. You've also got lots of people wanting to produce local information and knowledge, community journalism, etc. And so around the world in many different countries you're finding experimentation with neighbourhood hyperlocal sites. What's still not clear is exactly which versions will work. So some of them are very much about news, but often once you have a local platform, it turns out you might as well use it for other things like exchange or the sharing economy or sort of posting tasks or time banks and so on. One of the things we're trying to do at Nesta is partly support experiments in different models of hyperlocal media. There's a technology side to that. What mix of sort of smartphones, augmented reality and so on will actually work best for people? And there's also an experimentation around business models. How do you fund these things? Can you get sufficient classified advertising to pay for them? Can they actually pay for anything more than volunteer staff? And I think the honest answer is the jury is still out. And I think we're going to see in the next 2 or 3 years a bit of a mess, but a creative mess as different models are experimented with here in the US, Korea, all over the world. And hopefully, within a few years, we'll know what actually works. There will be very reliable common platforms and tools and methods. So anyone can create their own hyperlocal media outlet quite easily. We may have a little bit of light touch accreditation so that you can tell if your local one actually abides by basic principles of integrity and honesty and so on. But I think if we get this right, these platforms will become the key glue of local communities in the future, perhaps playing a role that in the past was played by churches or mosques or community centres. It's quite hard to say what the rate of growth is. There clearly is some growth. Much of it is driven, though, I think, as much on the supply side as on the demand side. And we've done some surveys of the landscape of provision and the landscape of advertising. But the truth is there aren't very accurate data here or in any other country about what the scale of this sector is, let alone what its potential scale is. I think some of the biggest gaps probably come from linking a hyperlocal media site to other things. So for example, could you link much more to secondary schools so that kids, as a matter of course, make programs, as it were, or videos, do local news, act as information gatherers. That's happening in a few places, and it's really good for children to learn those skills, and it's obviously good for the hyperlocal media. There are other things like linking to exchange systems. So some of the other collaborative consumption sites we support here at Nesta, which help people share their cars or their household equipment or childcare, things like that have an obvious fit with hyperlocal media and give them new uses, new reasons for people to be engaged. So I think thinking about them too much from a media point of view, as if they're just a journalism outlet, probably gets it wrong. More the question is what kind of shared community resource do we need now, 2014, and beyond, and how many different functions can you combine together to get as much traffic as possible, as much engagement and as much co-ownership? Well, the current hyperlocal media are all coming from slightly different sources. Some very much offshoots of media, some offshoots of local councils, some more coming from mobile phone companies. And I still think it's unclear exactly which ones will prevail in the long run. And in a way, we're a little bit like the position of radio in the early 1920s. New medium comes along, people try out all sorts of things. In the case of radio, what ended up prevailing, i.e. broadcast radio, no one had imagined even 10 years before. So I would expect surprises. To set up a really successful hyperlocal medium, you need in some ways the skills for setting up anything in a local community. You've got to get engagement, you've got to talk to lots of people, you've got to create relationships, and it's not enough just to think of producing output unless people feel a co-ownership. They may or may not like what you do. You've got to quickly then mobilize volunteer resources, and some of those will be for producing content or links and so on. And probably fairly early, you've got to think very rigorously about the economics. Are you going to be selling classified advertising, which is the the obvious route? If so, how? How will you be competing with Google, who will be your main competitor in doing that? Are there other institutions who you can be sufficiently useful to, like the local council, which has to do all sorts of communication functions and pay for them, that will help you make all the elements stack up? And one of the things we've been doing at Nesta is providing lots of guidance on the building blocks of successful models, so hopefully unnecessary mistakes won't be repeated.